It was just another normal day in the shop, trying to contemplate super important things like solving world hunger, what size shoe Taylor Swift wears, and making the best woodworking video ever made, ever. And then Sean came in.
Hey dude, I had an idea for making the best woodworking video ever. You should do something like unique and different, like
An epoxy river table.
That is a stupid idea, Sean.
look at you. Your style sucks. Well, except for those boots. Do you have any better ideas? Because you look like a middle-aged divorcee that got lost at Disneyland.
And then it came to me.
I do have a better idea. All the other famous woodworkers do it. Mid-century modern.
Now, I'm getting married soon, meaning finances are tight and I couldn't go out and buy new wood. So I decided to use a stack of red oak I had to make a credenza/console thing for my lady. It presented a nice challenge as I could only use what I had in the shop to get this done. I sorted through the pile and found this nice board with defects that I thought would look really cool filled in white. Starbond recently came out with this medium thickness white colored CA glue and it was perfect for filling these. I decided to do it before milling so I didn't have to worry about sanding everything down. I no longer had a miter saw station so I had to rely on this Kreg jig and circular saw to start breaking these things down. The reason I needed them short was to fit them on my CNC. They're too wide to fit on my jointer and I didn't want to go through the process of ripping, milling, and gluing everything back together, which is what you would have to do for this project if you didn't have a CNC. I used a bunch of double-sided tape and wedges to secure these to the CNC bed. This particular tape is my favorite because it's strong but it doesn't leave residue on the wood. After laying them into place, I used small wedges and razor blades to prop everything up nice and even for milling. I have this white side 1-inch diameter flattening bit which is perfect for this task. It's relatively cheap and has lasted through quite a few flattening projects. I'll leave a link below in the description if it's something you're needing. I then manually controlled the CNC and shaved off about 1/16 of an inch until everything was nice and flat on one side. It was pretty satisfying to see the white CA glue expose itself perfectly flat with the top. Once off the CNC, I began marking the opposite face of each board with pencils so I knew how much I was removing at the planer. I simply kept planing each piece until all the pencil marks were gone. Once the thickness, which was just around an inch, I cleaned up one edge of each board on the jointer so I could reference at the table saw. I ripped each board down to approximately 11 inches wide as a final part of the milling process. I then immediately jumped to aesthetic choices in building. The table saw was set to 30 degrees to the left to add an interior chamfer on both edges of each board. This was strictly an aesthetic choice and can vary from woodworker to woodworker. I love creating odd-angled chamfers on the table saw. It creates a certain depth and appeal that reminds me of Four Eyes Woodworking or even Blacktail with his famous 30 degrees angle chamfer router bit. I busted out the miter saw and clamped it to my bench to cut these down to length because they were too long for the miter gauge at the table saw. I think I ended up cutting them down to about 42 inches for the top and bottom portions. I desperately need to build a miter saw station, so if anyone has any ideas or links to their favorites, drop them in the comments so I can check them out while also promoting other woodworkers. For the joinery, I decided to use a large 45-degree chamfer bit to create miter joints. These will be reinforced, and I had an odd idea for the corners, which we will see later. This is honestly one of the easiest ways to achieve that perfect 45-degree miter for the boards like this. I started marking out where I wanted to place floating tenons. I don't have a domino joiner yet, so this method has been my workaround for mitered quote-unquote dominoes. Using some stock I milled up to 1/4 inch for tenons, I marked where I wanted to place them with a pencil. Then, using scraps, I created a makeshift base to clamp onto the bottom of the workpiece. This base allows my trim router with a 1/4 inch spiral bit to cut out a mortise for the tenons. Using my trim router, I slowly started plunging towards the center of the marked area and use the mitered angle as a reference surface to cut the mortise side to side. It's not always a perfect fit for these situations, but it does get the job done. Before gluing up a cabinet box, it's always a good idea to sand the interior to your desired finishing grit. For gluing up miters, I like to superglue scrap cutoffs directly to the workpiece. It holds strong for the clamps and is easy to remove and clean up later. Using my big fat camera blocking elbow, I applied glue to the necessary surfaces and used the small tenons to line everything up. Then I just clamped it up and let it sit for a while to dry. So far, so goodish. After it was dried up, I used a rubber mallet to knock off the scrap pieces I used for glue up. Some force was definitely necessary. 120 grit sandpaper made quick work of the leftover CA glue on the surface, and it was time to move on to bigger and better things. After I do one more thing. Using a big 3/4 inch roundover bit, I rounded the edges just to see what it looked like. I hated it, so I decided to come back with a fix, but we'll get to that later. Onto the plywood. I had some oak ply laying around and thought it would be perfect for an inset face frame. I cut it in a way that kept all of the grain horizontal to the length. They were all cut to 2 inches wide, and once to size, I applied edge banding for the parts that would be exposed. Iron-on edge banding is my favorite. It's so easy to apply and super satisfying to trim away. It's also extremely necessary if you don't want ugly plywood edges visible in your project. I'm not a fan of stain by any means, but since I couldn't buy new material and I wanted this to stand out, I whitewashed these face frame pieces for contrast. I wanted to ebonize them, but the lady wanted white, and she knows nothing about good taste other than her taste in men because I'm fantastic. I mean, I am the one with a collection of Hawaiian t-shirts and fanny packs. Since I'm not a real woodworker, I decided to use pocket holes to attach these face frames. Based on the grain direction of the cabinet, this method was a solid and safe choice, especially since it will be holding heavy doors. Using a scrap piece of ply as a spacer, I placed the pieces in accordingly before ultimately clamping them down and screwing them into place from the back. Back to the corners to finish off the cabinet. I milled up some 1/4 inch walnut stock to fill and reinforce the mitered corners. I also used the leftover pieces to create a border around the inset face frame, which you'll see later. Using this Typon quick thick stuff, I glued the walnut strips in place and clamped them down with blue painter's tape. It was nearly impossible to clamp these with actual clamps, so the tape had to do, and it worked just fine. I impatiently flushed them up with a flush cut saw and let them sit to dry while moving on to the doors. With my leftover, unmilled oak boards, I decided to combine traditional woodworking with futuristic techniques. First, I needed them milled, so I ripped them in half at the bandsaw as they were a little wonky. I got a flat face and edge on the jointer and took them down to equal thickness at the planer, before ripping them and cross-cutting them to size at the table saw. At the router table, I routed a 1/4 inch groove to one edge of each workpiece to fit the door panels in. This was achieved in small passes with the spiral router bit. These are traditional rail and style doors, so I used my table saw to create the mortise and tenon joints to fit them together. This process was made a bit more difficult because my table saw doesn't have macro adjustment abilities for the height of the blade for some reason. So there was a lot of test fitting and messing around with the setup until I got all of the pieces to fit correctly. I used a flat top grind blade for this as it provided the cleanest tenons possible. Before we get to revealing the fit of those joints, let's see how I made the panels. I had 2 figured maple billets laying around, which I originally wanted to use for guitar tops. I resawed them to get a book match appearance to make the door panels become the focal piece of the overall build. Toying with the grain like this can take any project to the next level. I cleaned up the edges to create a nice glue line and then set them up for glue up. Using Typon 3, I glued both door panels up with some panel clamps and did my best to ensure they were flat so I wouldn't lose any thickness later on. I didn't want to joint end grain, so I used a scrap piece of ply as a straight edge reference on the table saw to begin cutting these down to size. This also ensured the center line of the book match was true 90 to the edges. Once cut on one side, I could use the table saw fence to rip the other side to the correct size. I decided to add a little bit of flair to the panels by carving the fleur-de-lis symbol. My lady and I are both from St. Louis, and this symbol is all over the place downtown. Since we moved further out into a more rural setting, I wanted to make her feel more at home by having this reminder carved into the door panels. Also, I don't have a name for my CNC yet and would love some suggestions. Leave them in the comments if you have a good one. The funnier, the better. Final steps were to use this big table edge router bit for the aesthetic pillowed edge effect before adding a 3/4 inch straight bit to create the tenon edges of the panel. This big table edge bit is awesome. I use it to help shape guitar necks too, and it works flawlessly. I use a wire brush attachment on my Dremel to clean out the little burrs left behind on the CNC. This thing is great for these hard to reach places. and a final sand to 180 grit was completed, and it was time to move to gluing up the doors. These tenons fit super tight and almost too tight. Once in place, I just slid the panel into the grooves and clamped the top piece into place. I honestly loved how they were turning out. Once dry, I used the Kreg hinge jig to bore out the holes for the hinges. This thing makes it super easy to place accurate holes for a variety of hinges. I just don't think the Forstner bit that comes with it is very good. If you're wanting affordable soft close hinges that work well with this jig, then I'll link these in the description as well. I always have a bag of them laying around the shop just in case I need them, and the best thing is they're super adjustable. I moved on to cleaning up the walnut corners with that 3/4 inch roundover bit, and remembered I still had to make some sort of leg base. I set a random angle on my miter gauge and cut 4 separate feet to size with it. I didn't want to get too crazy here, but I wanted the base to add flavor to the whole thing. I cut some lengthy stock for the feet to attach to and began gluing up the butt joints. These were definitely reinforced later with 2.5 inch screws that will never be seen. Before reinforcing with screws, I rounded over all the edges to contrast the sharp chamfers of the cabinet but also matching the rounded corners. Once the base was complete, I added Rubio to the top and watched that grain come to life. I liked these defects so much that I decided to make them the top portion of the whole piece. The Rubio added great contrast between the white CA glue, oak, and walnut, and had really tied everything together. I finally got to move this thing out of my shop and up to my lady's office. Needless to say, she loved it. I'm not sure if this is mid-century modern or not, but it's definitely cool and I enjoyed the process. All the defects, colors, and shapes in this build give it its own unique style and character. If you enjoyed this video, remember it's completely free to leave a comment and press that like button. If you want to see more, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification thing because I have more builds in the works. Be sure to check out these build videos and playlists I have in the description, and thanks for watching and happy building.